Thank you, everyone. Welcome back to the New Works Forum here at Annual Conference 2013 from Vancouver, British Columbia. My name's Laura Lee Everett. I'm the Artistic Services Director, and I know everyone in the room already heard that, but I am repeating it because we are now streaming live to the National Opera Center in New York City. Everybody want to cheer and wave at our friends in New York. I also would like to let you all know that there are QR codes on the doors at the back of the hall. It's part of our survey called Rate This Conference. So for all of you who have smart devices, and I see them, I know you have smart devices, before you leave today at the end of this session, if you would take a picture of the QR code and rate the session and give us some feedback, that would be fantastic. The next portion of what we're going to discuss for the New Works Forum will then lead us into the afternoon working group, and this is the part we want to share with our constituents around the world who are watching on the live stream, as well as the folks who are attending the symposium in New York. We're going to discuss the choices of libretto and how you construct the way you go forward in a piece, adapted versus original material. And at this point, I would like to hand it over to our wonderful moderator for this part of the discussion, Larry Adelson.
Thank you. Thank you, Laura Lee, and thank you, Lindsay, for inviting me to moderate this panel. I'm going to ask all the panelists to introduce themselves in a moment, but I want to try to put a little bit of a frame around what we're going to talk about. When Lindsay asked me to moderate this, my first thought was, how do we organize this discussion? This is something that, if anyone knows me, I could talk about for hours, days, months, with no stop. And I know that everyone on this panel is equally passionate about the subject. I wanted to try to get into not just idealistic conversation, but some real practical and actionable ideas for the artists and the administrators that we have in the room. And one of the first questions I asked myself is, what are the drivers between developing and presenting adaptations versus truly original stories in opera? And I think some insight can be found by looking at Opera America's New Works directory, which, if any of you aren't familiar online, there's a full list historically of what new works have been produced by member companies. And there is definitely a link, some may say a correlation, between the size of a company, its budget, the size of their venue, and the tendency for the larger companies to lean more towards adaptations to truly original stories. Smaller companies whose missions are oriented more towards new works development and towards artist mentorship tend to do more completely original work than their larger brothers and sisters. So I go back to my question about what is driving the decision to do adaptations versus original work, and there really are three different areas I'd like to organize our discussion, and that is artistic, marketing, and development, all areas that we talk about whether we're doing La Boheme or Moby Dick. But to start the conversation, I'd like to ask each panelist to introduce themselves and their organization or their relationship to new work, because you have many organizations, Jean. And the question I'd like to ask you is, what are the artistic motivators, keeping for the moment financial considerations out of mind, behind your new works initiatives and your choices about the type of work that you're developing? So Ned, why don't we start with you?
Gosh. And here I thought I had a bunch of time to think about my answer. You're tricksy. My name is Ned Canty. I'm General Director of Opera Memphis. I also, before becoming General Director, I worked with American Opera Projects in Brooklyn for a number of years, specifically as their Director of Libretto Development, and that meant working both with the Composers in the Voice series, as well as on specific projects, doing libretto readings before a note of music had been written. Worked on both adaptations and original works there. As General Director of Opera Memphis, I've been wanting to create an opera, commission an opera since I got there, and spent a lot of time trying to find out what would really speak to the soul of the city in a very specific and unique way that also would be universal. And we ended up commissioning a piece called Ghosts of Crosstown, which is I'll try to keep this brief, but the Sears Crosstown building is a 1.5 million square foot former Sears distribution center. There were 10 of them throughout the country when Sears was the catalog business that it was, the Amazon of its day. This is a building that was central to an entire neighborhood in Memphis that almost everybody in Memphis above a certain age has a story about. They had their first job there, they bought their wedding dress there, they used to go there for Christmas shopping, they remember the smell of the popcorn, or if when it closed down in the 80s, they remember breaking in with their friends and drinking and listening to punk rock music. Everybody has a story about it. It's currently being renovated and turned into a combination of artist live workspace, housing for universities and doctors. It's a very exciting project, and I wanted to somehow be involved with it. So we've commissioned 5 short operas, 5 to 10 minutes each one inspired by the life of somebody who was either worked there or intersected with the space in some way. So we have a librettist who's come up with 20 ideas for librettos, sometimes with a bit of text, sometimes with just characters. We're in the process now of sending those out to the 5 composers who will each choose which theme resonates with them, and then we will write the librettos based on that. Does that answer the question?
That's great. Thank you. Michael.
I'm Michael Morey from Tapestry Opera in Toronto. I think it's a little bit more interesting to introduce Tapestry first. I have a history of being a performer. I have done a lot of new works, both as a singer and some as a music director and some as a director. But Tapestry has been around for 30 years, and especially in the last 15 years has been focusing on new opera commissioning and producing. And we've produced over 10 full works, some for chamber, some for full orchestra, as well as worked with over 110 different librettists and composers through our training program. And I think what is an artistic motivator for our company certainly is that there are stories from our era that are as interesting and as relevant and far more engaging for the living audience that lives in, I think, Canada and the United States, that will engage with these stories in this fantastically involved art form.
Kevin.
Well, you've already met me and heard a little bit about me, and but I would say that in what I am now is I'm Opera America's field consultant, and I don't normally work in new works. However, I do have a new works project for which I'm a seller, I want to say. It has nothing to do with Opera America, and I think I've got a buyer in a major opera company, but I can't really talk about it because the commissioning agreement is pending as we speak. But I just want to say that when it comes to subject and it comes to from an artistic perspective, I think inspiration can come from anywhere. If you identify a composer you're interested in, oftentimes, and historically at Minnesota Opera, we would talk to that composer. Do they have a particular librettist, or if you're starting with a librettist, what are they interested in? And more often than not, it would be an existing story. And that's a tradition in opera. I mean, they started doing Greek stories, and then they do contemporary literature. If you look at most of the standard rep, most of these are not original stories, and I think one of the reasons for that is just we're skipping to the marketing piece, but it's a big art form, and you need to attract an audience, and having an identifiable story or title or a topical one that people are already aware of is an advantage. But from my point of view, it really has to do with from the artist's point of view, what's motivating, what stimulates them, what are they excited about. And interestingly, though, some of the best results that I think that as a production company of new works that we got in Minnesota in recent years was switching it to become more of that kind of Broadway producer that says, we want to do an opera based on something, and we're going to go find a composer. Silent Night was an example of that. It's a movie. We wanted to find a composer and librettist who could realize an opera based on that movie. And Kevin Putz and Mark Campbell were selected. They were told, given their marching orders. It wasn't their idea, but they liked the idea. They were inspired, and they did it. I really think it can go either way, but I think given the traditions and economics of opera, I'm not surprised that more stories are adaptations rather than original.
Kim.
Hi, I'm Kim Whitener from here in New York City. Here Art Center, the long name, and also the co-artistic director and producer of the Prototype Festival, which is our new initiative in collaboration with Beth Morrison Projects. I think in representing both here and Prototype and by in absentia BMP, our focus is on usually most often work and completely wholly original works that come to us from the artists themselves. At here, our core program is a resident artist program through which we commission, develop, and produce work in multidisciplinary forms and all kinds of genres, but we have for years been making opera theater and music theater, and our niche is what we are calling mid-career artists who've been working for 5 to 10 years but who've not really had their breakthrough process. And it's also a project, and it's also a long-term process where we're working with these artists for 2 to 3 years to develop their project through works in progress, workshops, and then ultimately a final production. So that's our model of development, and the projects can include adaptations. In fact, the Scarlet Ibis, which is the one we're producing now that will premiere in January 2015, is an adaptation of a James Hurst short story from the 60s. So I think the real calling card, though, for what we do, what BMP does, and what Prototype is doing is featuring 21st century projects, and we don't mean to claim that for ourselves. I think there are many companies that are doing this now, but the definition of that being really original music and librettos that are coming out of the experience of the 21st century that include 21st century inputs that often have elements, whether it's multimedia, whether it's rock and pop, whether it's hip hop, that are infused into the work itself.
Hello, my name is Gene Shear, and I'm an opera librettist. I've been working with a number of composers, mainly over the last number of years with Jake Hagee, which has been a wonderful collaboration. And recently I've been working on a new opera based on Cold Mountain with Jennifer Higdon, and a new piece with a wonderful English composer, Joby Talbot, for the Dallas Opera, based on the story depicted in Into Thin Air, the John Krakauer's book. But it'd be interesting to talk a little bit about that when we can talk about rights, because it's been an interesting process and a sort of circuitous route. In terms of what I'm interested in doing, projects come to me frequently from the composer who is passionate. He or she is very passionate about a particular piece, and then I have to decide whether I share that passion. And sometimes as in the case of Cold Mountain, I come up with the idea myself. But what I'm looking for is something that, as was just said, that I'm really passionate about. But for me, something that I believe that music can really explore in a unique way. It's not just something that I'm passionate about. I have to believe that there's something that music can bring to the table to explore whatever the source material is in an original way. I mean, Moby Dick, Herman Melville didn't need us to establish Moby Dick. It does just fine on its own. But we were trying to find ways to allow music to illuminate the book in new ways, and that's what I'm sort of looking for every time I'm out when I'm starting a new project. Practically speaking, there's no question that Adaptations, it's much easier to sell a project that has name recognition. I think we all know that. So a lot of the pieces that Jake and I have done, for example, that are original pieces are been more chamber works. We're doing pieces for Music of Remembrance, which is a wonderful organization in Seattle next week, based on the life of a Auschwitz survivor, and other pieces that we've done along the way. So that's definitely an interesting thing to discuss. The challenge of doing a new opera, a new grand opera based on an original subject is very, very challenging in terms of the sell, I think. More than anything, what I'm looking for is something that I'm going to, spend 2 years of my life working on and believing that music has a way of opening up in new and creative and exciting ways.
And just very briefly, I'm Larry Edelson at American Lyric Theater. What drives us artistically much, as with all of my colleagues here, is the interests and passions of the artists. Organizationally, we definitely have a market orientation. I think that's something which we're not ashamed of. I said in my question to keep all the financial issues out of it, but of course that's impossible. We all know that. But the question that comes up for us, we've just commissioned last year 3 new full-length works. One is an actual adaptation of a memoir for which we had to acquire the rights. It's called The Long Walk. It's based on a returning Iraq vet who is dealing with reintegration into his family life. One is about the scientist Alan Turing, mathematician, who broke the Nazi Enigma code. We didn't need any rights for that, but it is a form of adaptation, in my mind at least, because it is a telling of a story which is somewhat in the public consciousness. And the third is La Reina, which some of you saw at the Newark Sampler, an excerpt of the Newark Sampler, which is inspired by real-life events, but is a fictionalized story. When an artist approaches me about a subject that they're passionate, the question I ask them is, why opera? What is it about this story that begs to be told in an opera? Why shouldn't it be a music theater piece? Why not a play? What is it that the resources of opera can do to bring the story to life better or in a more exciting way? And if an artist can articulate that and get me on board, if that's required, if I don't already think that, then we put the full resources of the company behind them to help them bring their vision to life. Jean, you brought up some of the legal issues, and of course this is definitely an issue with adaptation. I'd like to talk a bit about the approaches to the acquisition of underlying rights. In your varying experiences, who takes on the responsibility and the cost of acquiring the rights? And have you found particular approach to the acquisition better than others? For example, option agreements versus purchase agreements, having the existence of exclusivity clauses in the agreements. Why don't I start with you, Gene, and we can move on.
Well, my experience has been the following with regard to rights. When I started doing this, I always thought, the lawyer would sort of handle that. And when one certainly needs legal representation to write a contract and make sure that everything is lined up. But amazingly, I shouldn't say surprisingly, the rights for the projects that I have done, almost in every time, I have had to make some sort of personal appeal to the source copyright holder, the writer, let's say. I'll give you an example with Cold Mountain. After many, many months and sort of in vain trying to acquire the rights, I contacted in frustration a novelist friend of mine in North Carolina, just saying, Michael Malone, a wonderful novelist, and say, this is a shot in the dark, but you live in North Carolina, Charles Frazier lives in North Carolina, do you know him? He says, no, but I know someone that knows him, and that person didn't, but she knew a bookseller who knew Charles and Catherine Frazier. I was able to get the email, and that's basically how, and then Jennifer was able to contact them, and then we brought the lawyers in later along the way. And that's happened time and time again. I think that maybe this is not a surprise to everyone in this room, but it was certainly a surprise to me, and certainly for younger folks in the business, that you just can't delegate. You need to be very, very proactive. So many things in this business are based on relationships, and it's just just to digress for 1 second, Richard Perlman, who I bet some of you still know from the old days, he's passed away. He was a teacher of mine who was in the business for years. He was, very quickly, he was at the Kennedy Center at the Young Artists Program, and he was doing back in the 70s when everything was done in translation. He was saying, I forgot the name of the work, I forgot the work, but he said, if I could get anyone to translate this, who would I get? And he got, he looked up W.H. Auden in the phone book, and Auden wound up doing it, and they became friends. And that's what when I got in touch with Michael Malone, that's what I was thinking, because I wanted to do a project with him based on one of his novels. And it led circuitously to this. So my experience has been, as much as you'd like to delegate it to the lawyers, you need to pick up the ball and do it yourself.
And in your experience, you and your collaborators have acquired the rights. It hasn't been the companies that have been doing this for you.
Yes, we usually, not surprisingly, the opera business, as we all know, is composer-centric in terms of the way in which commissions are given. Jake, Jennifer, Tobias, Joby have gotten these commissions and then either subcontracted or were bought as a team. But the business angle is going through the composer, and so the composer is procuring the rights, and then and that's how it happens. I mean, that can be built into the commissioning agreement in terms of how much how the expenses are shared. But yes, we have to, as a collaborative team, procure the rights, even if it's done with the help or the aid of the commissioning company, and whether the financial resources are shared. I don't want to monopolize, but I can also talk about different ways of doing this. With Into Thin Air, it was a whole different story. So.
We're going to get back to that in a moment,
Yeah.
but Kevin, could you address some of your experience with Minnesota?
Yeah, I just want to say that we that is the tradition upon which we've done commissions historically, where the creative artist, particularly the composer, would gain the rights. But in later years, we started doing that ourselves, and the company would do the rights. And then as part of the commissioning agreement, we had to assure that we had the rights, so that the artists weren't being exposed to anything. But it was interesting, and a lot of times we didn't get rights on projects. We would try for months and years, and we would have all these balls in the air. And if it was a popular thing like Cold Mountain, and oftentimes it might have been a book turned into a movie, and the rights were now owned by MGM or somebody rather than the author and his publisher. It got really interesting and dicey. But it all ended up being relationship-based, and we found that it was really ultimately to our advantage, and really to the composer's advantage, particularly if we were picking the subject matter, to acquire the rights ourselves and save them from all that. Back to Silent Night, that was a French film company, and surprisingly, we wrote them a letter, basically described it, proposed what we thought were terms, and they said, hey, this is great, what a neat idea, turning our movie into an opera. God, who knows, Right. It happened, but I can tell you a whole bunch of others that didn't. And I can also mention The Grapes of Wrath, for example, and I'll just be really quick because this illustrates a few points. It took us 10 years to get the rights to The Grapes of Wrath. The only reason why we even got our foot in the door is because Eric Simonson, the director-dramaturg on that project, was a member of the Steppenwolf company that did the theatrical version, and he knew John Steinbeck's widow. So making that connection, she put me in touch with this attorney who was kind of eccentric and interesting, and it took years and years, and they wanted to, they needed to approve the outline and the libretto, which they never got around to approving, by the way. And as it turns out, we did get the rights, we did do the piece, but had we not gotten those rights within that year or so, the widow having died, the family having a big internal dispute with the estate, our window was and the attorney dying, we almost didn't get it even after all of that, but it was all relationship based.
Did you ever, did the composer librettist ever start projects before the rights were actually acquired?
Did we ever start? I think what we did is we discussed, and I don't think we ever started anything. We might have done some sketching, but generally, if we thought that there was a good prospect that we were going to get the rights, we might do some preliminary work, but, very preliminary. It just doesn't make sense.
No, I mean, the timeline for acquiring works can be much longer than you ever anticipate. Michael?
I thought I would add a little bit of an easier story. Similar to Gene, we had two artists who were looking for adaptations, and our company's history is mainly in original works, like Oksana, which is the story about human trafficking, which you'll see on Friday. But one of our librettists, actually, was taking the lead, and she's actually our playwright in residence right now, Anna Chatterton. She went to approach the D.H. Lawrence estate for the rights to the Rocking Horse winner. And through just artist approaching basically the artist group, she acquired the rights for $500 and I believe 20% of all of her fee, and that was it, regardless of the company that produced it.
Ned, we briefly had a correspondence about the issue of life rights that can sometimes come up, and this might be an issue in your current project.
Yeah, one of the things that's been interesting is trying to decide really who's the star of this opera or opera cycle. Is it the building or is it the individual people? And is it better to be very clear and say this opera is inspired by, Joe Francis, or to take a story that he told and just put it 2 degrees away so that many people can look in on it? This is made more complicated by the fact that there's one person who worked there who is known and loved by pretty much everyone I've met in Memphis. And it's that kind of city where this one guy he's like the Zelig of Memphis. He's kind of shown up at every major cultural institution, and he now runs this big catering company that does every big event. And so the question is, by putting him into one of these operas, we build a level of interest, but then we also need to sort of talk to him and make sure that we're addressing it correctly. And also, do you want to get into creating an opera about a person who's so recognizable and still alive, and have people who knew him say, oh, he was nothing like that. That guy's way too tall. He didn't talk anything like that. Why'd you make him a baritone? That guy should be a tenor. So, we've been dealing more with the aesthetic issues around the life rights rather than the financial issues or the rights issues. I think that I would happily sign over all profits to him because I don't imagine we're going to make any. So
it's usually signing over a share of revenue, not profits.
Yes, I understand. But it's, I think for us right now, we're still at the point where we're trying to figure out the aesthetics of that and what is it that's going to make the piece both incredibly local and universal? Is it, taking the people's stories and making them a little more iconic, or is it making them incredibly specific?
Kim?
I just wanted to add on the issue of life rights. We're developing now for January 2014, actually, a piece called Thumbprint by Kamala Sankaram and Susan Yankowitz. And Susan Yankowitz, this is a story about Mukhtar Mai, the Pakistani girl who was gang raped, and then stood up for the first time and went to police and then to judges, and she won her case, and then was awarded money that then she used to start a school. And so, of course, she's still here, and very much so. And Susan Yankowitz had been working on a piece about her for several years as a play, and then they came to Kamala Sankaram about writing the music. It was an interesting reversal. That was one of my first questions. It's like, she's quite a prominent, internationally known woman, Mukhtar Mai, and do we have the rights to her story, current events? Do we have the right to her story? Susan assures me that she has spoken with Mukhtar and her people, and that she does have the rights, but I'm in the process of making sure we have that in writing. So.
Great. I know that for us at ALT, when we acquire rights, we do an option to purchase agreement. For those of you not familiar, it's a very small upfront payment, which can be spread over a number of years, and then the purchase price is linked to the date of premiere. That is an easy way to manage the cash flow on an acquisition, especially when the purchase price can be quite high. I'm curious, Kevin, in Minnesota, did you follow a similar model, or did you do straight-out purchases for the acquisitions of rights?
We generally did straight-out purchases for acquisitions of rights. It was interesting, back to the Grapes of Wrath, and I was thinking about this. I might have said this earlier, that when it came down to, okay, we've made contact with the attorney, with the estate, they say go ahead. Well, how are we going to structure this on? And before I could open my mouth, the attorney says, well, why don't we just use the agreement that we had with Carlisle Floyd of Mice and Men? Looks good to me. So she sends it to me, faxes it to me, and it's like a page and a half or 2 pages, and it's very simple and very straightforward, and the payment's up front. And I think that they were savvy enough, and generally these folks are savvy enough to know that whatever money they're going to get up front. Sometimes there are residual rights, but typically not. And basically everything has been very straight up and up front.
So your agreement was a page and a half for?
Well, we ended up, actually it wasn't too long. It was maybe about 2.5, 3 pages by the time they added a few. It was very simple and very, and once again, it was all thanks to Carlyle and back to all of that. I mean, it was just amazing. That piece of it was really simple. We didn't have to spend, when we talked about spending 10 years to get the rights, it wasn't arguing over the details. It was just really whether we had the rights or not.
Yeah. Great. I'd like to move into something that we all think about, and that's how are we going to pay for projects like these, the development side of the equation. And examine strategies that how they differ for funding truly original stories or stories that there is not as great a frame of reference for your funders and for your audience versus adaptations of well-known stories. Do any of my esteemed panelists have some practical advice for overcoming the challenges of funding projects where there isn't that recognition factor? Crickets.
Well, I mean, one thought is that when the project is tied to the community in some way, I mean, and this might sound strange, but Into Thin Air, which I'm doing for Dallas with Joby Talbot, it's what does Dallas have to do with it? Well, Beck Weathers, who is the man, I don't know how familiar you are with the story, even though it was a bestseller back in the 90s. He was the guy who lost his hands and almost died on the mountain, and he's a local Dallas resident. And he's very, very well known in the Dallas community. And in order to get the rights for this, since it was really, given the nature, it's a one-act opera, there wasn't the money for this project to procure the rights from Krakauer, I decided to base this piece on interviews. I'm doing first-person interviews with all of the survivors that I can contact. And I've been very successful actually using Beck and then to contact other survivors from this doomed expedition in '96. And what's happened is there are now sort of representatives of different communities who are all of these survivors who connect the project to those communities. So and how do you connect it? There are people from Seattle, there are people from Colorado, there are people from Dallas, there are people from different places, and all of these places have opera companies which potentially could leverage those relationships. So I think that's one way to connect it, is to connect it obviously, and this is something I'm sure you all know, just to connect it to the community, even though it's sort of an unusual piece.
In our case, we designed the project to put all of the money that we could raise, as much as we could, to go to the artists involved. So the piece was designed from the ground up to be producible on a wide variety of budgets. So each piece has 1 or 2 singers. Each piece has 1 to 4 instruments, and if you choose to do only 1 instrument, it can't be piano. And originally the idea was that it would take place in the building before we found out how much stuff was in the building and how much they needed to get all of that stuff out of the air and the walls and whatnot. The idea was that the Ghosts of Crosstown idea was that each of these was sort of a memory of the building, and the only lighting involved was going to be the audience roaming from opera to opera carrying flashlights, and they would essentially provide the lighting. So it was something, and since then we've moved on for a number of reasons in terms of how we produce it, but we tried to do it in such a way that you could do any one of the pieces alone, and B, you could do the pieces in almost any production context, so that it wasn't, so that would never be a fear, I guess.
And have these production considerations been used as leveraging for the funding specifically, or is that more about the budget?
I think it's more about the fact that I consider commissioning operas mission critical, and responsibility of any opera company in America should consider it a part of their mission. And so, but we are a very small company that doesn't have a history of commissioning work. So, how do you get the thin end of the wedge into that and do something that is exciting and broadly based and community based for as little money as possible, and then, sort of see where it takes you.
Great, Michael.
since a lot of what you do, and Kim as well, are very lean towards the more original stories.
Absolutely, and I think one way that we found was extremely successful was the question is, if you want to have a successful business, where is the need? And in terms of political plays, you might say, for example, right now, human trafficking is a huge issue. It's come up recently, both in as Canadians in Toronto and Vancouver, as something that is a massive, massive industry across the world. It's worth hundreds of billions of dollars, and yet most countries have almost no laws in place to battle this. So we have a fantastic playwright, Colleen Murphy, and talented young composer, Aaron Gervais, who have written this piece, The Enslavement and Liberation of Oksana G., a Ukrainian woman who comes from, who gets a job offer to be a cleaner in Italy that turns into the sex slave trade, and her fight with her captors, and eventual finding sanctuary in a safe house in Italy. And it's a real story that's happening still. I mean, this is set maybe 40 years ago, but this is not a story that is no longer relevant. This is still happening every day. And that issue was really, really attractive to our public. And we started a campaign called, originally, Women for Oksana G. Oksana G is the name of the young woman who was enslaved. And this was half about the art form and the opera, and really half about this is something that we need to talk about. We don't talk about it because we get locked into our normal lives, but this is one of the things that's still going on every single day. And we raised a tremendous amount of money, both for the commissioning of the next act, and also for towards groups that are supporting making human trafficking, fighting human trafficking, and making it an issue that is more in the eyes of the public.
I think that's really fascinating that your fundraising wasn't just about fundraising for your own project, but for a real important issue that tied into your project.
And this is in the Friday New Work Showcase, by the way.
Super. We definitely look forward to hearing that. Kim?
Well, I was going to say just something very similar to what Michael was saying, so I won't take too long, but whether it's an institutional funder, like a foundation or other kinds of institutional funders, or individual donors, that the subject matter, the content is really important to sell the excitement around, whether it's socio-political stories or whatever the substance is, and to engage those funders around those issues. That has happened with us a number of times, and we also take advantage of crowdsourcing. Now, of course, here our budgets are, $150,000 or $200,000 for a premiere. That's not the scale that we're talking about. We're doing chamber opera, black box opera. We're not talking about grand opera, but having that sense that your audience is also there to help fund, and doing the kind of social media and crowdsourcing is also something that we have done.
I also think it's important to educate the composers and the librettists of their role in selling the piece and in interfacing with the community. I know that in Dallas in particular, I did 15 lunches with board members, and Jake did his own version of that. And I think that for a lot of times people think our responsibility first and foremost is to write the composers and librettists to write a great piece that will attract an audience. But there are no ambassadors like the creators themselves to sell this idea and to get the community excited about it and the donor base excited about it. And I think for commissioning companies to sort of explain that to folks going in, that this is part of the gig, I think. And I'm so appreciative of the opportunity to get these companies to take these big risks on pieces that I'm involved in. I genuinely believe that it's my responsibility to partner with them and to try to sell it. And I think that's a big aspect of the job. I think for composers and librettists, and since you're not trained for that in school, to understand that this is part of the gig, I think it's important to be educated that, in fact, this really is part of we're all in this together.
And of course, a big portion of the fundraising process is getting board buy-in to these projects. At ALT, we have a fairly small board, and I'm fortunate that they aren't terribly resistant to the ideas I bring before them, but it was certainly easier to get immediate enthusiasm for an opera based on Charlie and the Chocolate Factory than it was for an opera based on the drug wars in Mexico. One thing that we did, we also have a challenge in that all of our artists that we commission, it's their first full-scale operas, so we're dealing exclusively with emerging artists. I can't say, well, we're commissioning Jake Heggie and Gene Shear, and look at their fantastic track record. We had a Christmas party about 2 years ago where I had Jorge Souza write a version of Silent Night. And again, if you heard La Reina, you know he has a very specific musical language. And it absolutely grabbed the attention of two board members who were at this party and got them interested in him as a composer, leading into what you were saying, where they became so engaged in the idea of him as an artist that they wanted to know more about what he wanted to write about, even if it wasn't subject matter that they were immediately going to relate to. I'm curious, with my other panelists here, if you've had other particularly successful tactics to get board buy-in when the projects aren't immediately an easy sell.
Well, I'll just jump in very briefly to say that our board is sort of supportive of the overall mission. We don't separate out project by project. I realize it's very different for other organizations, but to us it's about having their support for everything that we do. And obviously we've got an uphill battle. We're doing new work by unknown artists. So it's just about selling the passion for the entire mission. And I've talked about that before in terms of the ways to get board members to really be introduced to a project. We absolutely bring the artists in. We bring them into board meetings. We have them there to talk about their projects as they are in development. We actually ask of our artists that they provide material on special pages on our website so that not only board members but members of our audience can take a look at where they are and their ideas and their process along the way. It's all about building buy-in early on in the development of the project. So there are a lot of strategies like that, but it is very much about getting people to connect with the artistry and the artists who are making it.
I think that there's over time. I think it's boards, the relationship that the board has with the staff, and particularly on an artistic and programmatic basis, is one of building trust, hopefully. And I find that if the company is successful in whatever it's doing, and in this case that includes new works like it did in Minnesota, that over time, there wasn't a board buy-in required. It was we balanced our budget, we sold tickets, we did increasingly good work, and the board was excited by that. And they were supportive of it, and unless and until things started really going awry, the board certainly wasn't going to second guess the decisions of the staff. The board didn't approve repertoire. They did approve the budget, but I think that we over time were able to build a sense of trust. But that frays very quickly with a project that goes awry, or all of a sudden you start running deficits or whatever. And I do really think that you can't ever take that for granted. And so, as much as on the long term, I think that there is a long-term relationship approach with your board that you can and should build, and you should identify new works if they are part of your mission. They should be clearly identified as part of your mission and program. But I also do think that each one of those new works in its own way, and not even the new works, everything we're doing, you just networked and you work with your board. And you really, you cultivate the project. You get them excited. You bring in the composer and the librettists, and do all those sorts of things to get them excited. And this is one of those things where if we're talking about the relationship between boards and staffs, and in general, it's an organic, ongoing process. But there's no reason in my mind why a competent staff that is reasonably persuasive can't convince the board to take some risks on the programmatic side, include new works. Sounds easy to say, I know.
Okay, well, adaptations of well-known source material can present some very specific challenges artistically and from a marketing perspective, because you are dealing with the perception of what an audience might think that work should be. I'd like to turn this first to Jean, as you've written the libretti for source material that's very much in the public consciousness. In terms of your artistic process, how or to what degree have you been influenced by what the public's thought of what a piece might or should be as you're writing the pieces?
I really don't think about it at all. I'm just trying to write a piece that I think is a musical representation, an operatic, distilled into an operatic form of whatever that source might be. And I'm not trying to guess what the audience's expectations are. I think I think you're chasing your tail if you're doing that, personally. I think you should be just trying to write a libretto and then an opera that's really good, that illuminates the source material in a creative way, that invites music to tell the story the way only music can. And I just don't, I clearly, in Cold Mountain, I'm telling the story, but you will eventually see, in 2015, when it opens, that I've created a few scenes that are not in the book, that are distilled, conflated versions of all these things. You have to accept the fact that, taking these long novels, Moby is particularly long, but you can't represent it all. And I think that frequently pieces that have gone awry are trying to take the page. We've all seen this. They take it from the page and they put it on the libretto, into the libretto, and it dies because it's not reinventing it as an operatic entity. And so that's for what it's worth, that's my plan. I really don't think about the audience's expectations. I know they're going to have expectations going in, but I'm trying to, more than anything, I want them to wake up, to this new source, in a new way, and that's why we're doing it in the first place, I think.
Kevin, can I ask you to address from the marketing perspective? You mentioned in our correspondence that you might have some insight into perceptions versus the reality of new projects. I think it was Handmaid's Tale you mentioned.
Perception. I don't think so.
No.
Can I think about it, or can somebody else?
Yeah.
Sure.
I'm just not there, so I'm just going to have to think about that. Thanks.
No.
Anyone else?
Okay. Michael?
I think our audience already expects sort of experimental, provocative, often socially conscious topics. And that's why very recently we're doing a quasi-adaptation of the Book of Ruth, which comes from the Bible. And the team are very interesting artists. One is the creator of Queer as Folk, the TV show, as well as Bomb Girls. So it's a really interesting, provocative team, but they're dealing with biblical material, which apparently a large amount of our audience has some interest in, but not necessarily positively. So that's just been a touching place, because we're just at the workshop stage right now. But it's interesting because we're facing now not being experimental enough somehow.
Okay, I've recovered now. I'm back. Sorry, it's been a long few days. When it comes to expectations of the audience, first of all, they have. First of all, you really have to define the expectations. We learned really early on, if you do a season brochure and you're doing La Traviata and you're doing an updated Traviata, but your photo and Traviata is a traditional one, you can sometimes run into trouble. You really have to telegraph what you're doing. It's especially true with a new work world premiere, North American premiere. You know, one of the things that in the New Works program that Minnesota Opera currently has included in that is a fairly substantial amount of money for special community interaction prior to the performance. It's not just more marketing, but it's a huge program involved in networking with other organizations, doing talks, gatherings, discussions, working with the local media. And when we did The Handmaid's Tale, for example, the North American premiere of The Handmaid's Tale, it was really interesting. There was we kind of worked, there was one of those community book reading things that public radio, they, was doing. They brought in Margaret Atwood. She talked about, Handmaid's Tale. The community read the book. We really worked with them, and one of the things that we did in that, as far as expectations goes, is there was this huge interest in The Handmaid's Tale at the time. This was right after 9/11. And, this is when Homeland Security was being established, and there was this whole issue over personal rights relative to national security. And The Handmaid's Tale really deals with a situation where people become so security conscious that they forego, or the culture forgoes, their individual rights. So it was extremely topical. There were editorials, the thing sold out. But I've actually, this is my one claim to fame. I was quoted in the New York Times based upon a comment I made at an Opera America conference. In fact, I was quoted twice, and it was the same quote. So I might as well get it for, use it for all it's worth. But basically, what the quote was about is that I thought, this is going to be a music theater representation, and a very compelling one. It's a beautiful piece, great piece, of this book. We don't need to let people know that it's an opera per se. That doesn't much matter. They're coming because they're really interested in seeing a theatrical version of the book. So we did everything we could to avoid putting our name or the word opera associated with it. And I really thought that really helped meet their expectations, of course. We did different things with our subscription audience. But when they got there, the audience was hugely satisfied because it was a very compelling, powerful piece. And I don't think that, quite honestly, I don't think we would have gotten a lot of people in the door had we just sort of done a more traditional operatic company approach to that.
Just one quick thing. Cold Mountain is a co-commission between Santa Fe and Philadelphia Opera. Opera Philadelphia, sorry, they changed their name. And one of the things, I've never heard of this, and I think it's fantastic with what they're doing in Philadelphia. There's maybe it's in your cities as well, the Big Read, where the whole city will read a book. Well, they're going to have 200,000 people read Cold Mountain before they show the opera. I mean, that's good marketing, I think. That should help sell tickets, and also engage people in the story in a really powerful way. So I thought that was a great idea.
I just wanted to make a general comment to follow on what Kevin said, which is we have coined, we didn't coin it. There are many people out there who've been using the word opera theater, but we have adopted it as a real sort of central image for what we do. Just because in general we do multidisciplinary work that combines different genres, but opera is the ultimate multidisciplinary art form, and we find with our audiences, which tend to be a younger demographic of 20 to 40 somethings, and growing a little older now, but that the word opera theater is one that is exciting to them. The idea that this is a theatrical form, this is part of what's exciting about theater now. So it's just a sort of general sense that we don't shy away from the fact that we're doing opera, but we're just saying, look, it's a really exciting form, and we're introducing it to you in new ways.
Great. Well, at this point, I'd like to open it to all of you for questions. If there are any areas that we've already discussed that you'd like to ask questions, or if there's anything we haven't touched on that you'd like to address, please feel free to do so. Down here.
Hi, I'm Roberta Becker with Golden Gate Opera in Marin County near San Francisco. I was just wondering if it's helpful to do a co-production with a company that's not so far away, to consider that if they were far enough away that it wouldn't interfere with your shared audience. But as for instance, if we did a co-production with somebody in Baltimore, that's far away. But if we did a co-production with somebody far away from the Bay Area, but not so far away, would that be helpful to us, or?
Sure, I think that's not necessarily specific only to Newark, but
maybe 100 miles away.
But sure. Anyone like to take that question?
You know, there's a co-production that's happening currently with Albert Herring that Opera Pacific Opera Victoria is doing with Vancouver Opera. They're very closely situated, but you know, it's the 100th anniversary of Benjamin Britten's birth, and it's something to take advantage of. There's some synergies between the two, and even in that situation, you might argue that there might be some audience overlap, but I think that you know, it was kind of a creative and you know, a generous collaboration on the part of both of them to do something that geographically close. If you're a small company, I mean, certainly you don't want to compete or you know, take other people's audience or compete for a mutual audience. But we have a big country, and even if you look at the Bay Area, I mean, if you were working with San Jose or something, you know, that's probably far enough for you to be able to collaborate. And when it comes to a physical production, you know, obviously the farther you travel, the more expensive it is. But you know, there are potential collaborators in this room in a geographical place all over North America that would make it more than worth your while in an economic point of view if you could establish a co-production partnership with them.
Other questions? Yes.
Hi, Suzanne Calvin with the Dallas Opera. I wanted to make a comment first. I think the big read is a great idea, but you have to be really careful because that kind of thing can backfire. We had a music director who delighted in telling audiences that they needed to take a day off and read a 500-page biography if they wanted to really appreciate the work they were going to see the following evening, and people would vote with their feet and go, okay, that's just more than I can handle. So you have to be really, really careful about how you market that. I think it's a great idea, but there's also some cautionary tales to tell about that as well. I spoke with a composer a few years back who was telling me that no one would ever do an opera of Lawrence of Arabia. And the reason for that is because no one could possibly better David Lean's version of the tale. Do you find that there are source materials that have simply been done so well that you shy away from even thinking about putting them on the opera stage because you just can't imagine that it can be done better?
I think for us, definitely, it goes to what I said earlier. We always ask the artist, and we ask ourselves, why opera? What is it about this project that begs to be made an opera? What is opera going to do to elevate it in a way that makes the material speak differently in an important way?
You know, Suzanne, when I think about that, it's I can't think of a way of doing Lawrence of Arabia, but I bet someone could, and it could be a chamber piece just with one aspect of that story, and it could be spectacular. Just, you know, it's what you can't do is try to do. It was David Lean, right? David Lean's film. But if you were to take it from a different perspective, as soon as you said it, I started thinking, well, maybe this could work. You know, this because and in fact, Lawrence of Arabia would have a hell of a name recognition, and how you're doing it, but have to be done completely differently, and not in probably a spectacular, a scenic way, but in a way that was really explored relationships in a really inventive way. And my goodness, maybe it could be fabulous. And so I don't think there's anything. There are subjects. I will say this: there are subjects that don't appeal to me because I can't think of how to do them. But in the right person's hands, as long as it's truly reinvented, maybe something wonderful could happen with that. So who knows? Lawrence of Arabia.
Oh, hi, Bob Baker, Canadian Music Center. Opera seems to be alive and well. The classics, are really selling well. What do you see, though? Is that an insatiable appetite, or do you see, is there a point where newer, more innovative, more relevant stories are going to take over, or do you see that? Is there Is that a trend, or is that something that everybody's pushing because, we just think of something new? But do people want something new? I think they do, but do you see a point coming where the older or the more traditional opera is not going to satisfy audiences, I guess? That's my point.
I think the history of opera is one of new works being added to the canon, and our mission is to make sure that there is enough creativity and enough new works going on that out of all of those, a certain number are good enough to be remembered 400 years from now, because the works that you're talking about were written over a centuries-wide span. And so in 100 years, I'm sure there are works that are right now being created somewhere in North America that are going to fit into that in 100 years.
I've just heard it said that it was a people's art form in a way, and I think what we're seeing is that when the pieces that we're putting on, people are just super excited about and sort of frantic to see. And of course, we're in New York, and all of the wonderful developmental organizations, I think, are really experiencing this too. That there is a real hunger for the new adventurous stories of our time that are being told by the composers and librettists of our time. So we're just seeing that palpably, feeling it palpably. And yeah, not all of them will survive, but we're sort of bringing up a whole new generation of opera goers as a result.
Amen.
I would just comment that the standard repertoire is not faring as well as you might have or may have described there. We've seen in the last decade a diminution of ticket sales throughout the industry and throughout the performing arts, throughout the entertainment industry, sports, and all sorts of things. And so when it comes to this influx of new energy, new ideas, new product, I really think that not only is it inevitable, I think that it's happening, and it's really essential because as I've talked to a lot of companies, they've just in a 2,000 plus seat hall, the number of operas titles that they can produce, they can count on reasonably filling that hall is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. It gets to the point where what hall are they going to be and what's the business model going to be? I think it's going to be probably somewhat smaller, more flexible, more creative, and that's where all this feeds into.
I think I have a mic. Yeah. Okay.
Oh, sorry.
This is a very exciting. I think that the chamber opera is becoming a sort of the new griot. The storyteller, the way of telling a story dramatically that the community, large or small community, global or local community, gathers around to find out, to reflect, feel. But I have a very terre-à-terre question, and it's about life rights. I may have missed it, but is there a place where we can find out about whose life needs to be paid for, or and how much you pay, and if you've been dead for 50 years, is that how do we determine whose life is in the public domain and whose isn't, and whether it's something that needs to be negotiated? Just curious about that. I've got some projects that
in my experience, first consult a lawyer who has expertise in this area, but if it is a public figure where the material from which the piece is being drawn are public records and newscasts and whatnot, it is most likely that that material is in the public domain. If you're basing it on someone's memoir, for example, then it's definitely something where you would either need life rights or actually the rights to the memoir if it's by that person or by that person and another author. Do you have experience with life rights at all, Kevin?
No, not really.
Okay.
I don't have a lot to add to that.
Okay.
But I do think that basically what you're looking at is finding an attorney who's going to advise you on that.
Yeah.
In a time of reality TV, the intellectual property lawyers are really going gangbusters, and so there are people out there who are really dealing in this regard.
I have a question. We talked earlier about this sort of this sort of bifurcation that's happened, and how in some ways you're starting to try to rebrand opera as opera theater. And if we look at opera as the canon that we know, we all know was the popular form at the time. And in the last century, there's been that sort of split between popular musical theater and opera. And I'm wondering, as we start to think about collaboration and even expanding networks, is there room for musical theater people in this room?
We think so, definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, our festival Prototype is an opera theater and music theater festival. Now, we make the fine distinction between music theater and musical theater, but it's, a very, the standard book musical versus the sung-through libretto of a music theater piece or an opera theater piece. But, these distinctions are really starting to disappear. And, certainly in our programming for both here and in our festival, we are realizing that, it's very hard to draw these lines. There might be one piece one year that has sort of a distinctive musical theater bent, but still adheres to some of the rules. And to us, that's exciting because it's about really bringing in audiences from a bunch of different places.
But I guess is Sondheim the 20th century?
We did, at Minnesota, we did some musicals, and we actually did a very operatic production of Passion by Sondheim, which was really a beautiful show, and it's interesting. We didn't really attract the musical theater audience. It didn't cross over, but it fit beautifully into an operatic season. And I do think that in the same way people are putting operettas and GNS into traditionally into their seasons, I think that there's room for musical theater in there as well. Absolutely.
I think that at least for ALT, we don't think of it specifically as musical or theatrical styles, but we think of it as the performing resources. We are, and I know this is somewhat actually different than what Kim is doing it here, but we are working with artists who are writing for the forces that more traditional opera houses are used to using. So that would be their orchestral forces and the classically trained voice. I think when you get into that sort of crossover with musical theater, then there's also the whole discussion of singing style. I think amplification is another question, but that's not, again, exclusive to opera or music theater. So.
Yes. My question sort of piggybacks on Barbara's, and I guess maybe Ned, Jean, and Michael, you can talk the difference sort of between the juxtaposition of rights versus the right to do something. And we are, at HGO, we output a lot of new works, and a lot of them are sort of based on community stories. So Jean has done some work for us, and we send people out and we collect these stories, and 10 times out of 10, let me say 9 times out of 10, we have people come back and that are so invested in the work that written stuff is not a problem. Our lawyers talk through some things, but we're in the midst of a project right now where we're telling this real-life story of a high school student, and our lawyers tell us that we have the rights to do this. It's a public story that was displayed on the news, and the text that our librettist has written is sort of pulled from the headlines, but we have been pseudo-unsuccessful in bringing this high school student on board ethically because we are telling her story. And we're not using her name, we're not using the name of there was a judge involved in this legal case where sort of the judge has the character of the judge. The shop owner has the shop owner is his name. And if you have any experience in maybe suggesting ways that we can work better about ethically telling the stories of our communities when the connection is not so present there.
That's a tough one. I'm sorry. I just said that's a tough one. I don't know. I don't know. Just off the cuff, it would be. I guess my impulse would be to change the story enough so that there's wiggle room legally. But I don't know. I did a piece with Jake years ago called "To Hell and Back," which was with the Philharmonia Baroque Orchestra in San Francisco. And the commission was based on something on Metamorphosis, Ovid's Metamorphosis, and wound up telling a story of abuse in Appalachia, and told a mythical story. But it was actually based, and no one really knows this, but it was based on a real story of a woman who was abused by her husband and the relationship she had with her mother-in-law. And I couldn't get the rights to that story. I changed it so much that I'm not worried about sort of legal ramifications of that. But that was my solution to that. I will say, in terms of the marketing of that piece, if the audience had known that it was tied to a real story, and that person had been willing to champion the piece or support the piece, I think it would have helped some. But rather than go down that road and without the permission of the person, I would be very. Personally, I'd be careful about it, and my impulse probably would be just to change it just enough. But that's just me.
Unfortunately, I need to wrap up right now. We are at time. I'm sorry, Donna, but Donna, come talk to us afterwards, and we.
My question simply has to do with all these wonderful hygiene. That all hygiene. That sounds strange, doesn't it? Right here in this whole gathering. My question has to do with the fact that all of these things that I'm hearing about, these wonderful topical subjects, are so filled with despair, are so depressing. How many people are writing comedy? How difficult is it to find something that's really amusing and uplifting and has our audience leaving with a sense of hope and joy rather than a sense of despair?
I'm with you, and believe me, I've been writing so many tragedies that I'm working on like two comedies at the moment. So I'm really with you. I think that needs to be part of the tapestry to make this work. So it's not just doom and gloom.
And we chose this year's Crosstown building specifically because it was a story of how a community was taking this building that had been an eyesore for so long, coming together, renovating not just that building, but really an entire neighborhood of Memphis. So it's an incredibly positive story, and that was important to us, that we were telling a story that wasn't about the sorrows of the past, because Memphis has plenty of them. It was about the optimism of the future. And we also wanted 5 operas because that allowed us to have some comic pieces, like the great beanbag shortage of 1978, which was a true thing.
But Don, I think
sold
it's
way too well.
A great idea, and maybe we should advocate for Opera America to have a special fund for the commissioning of new comedies, and we can talk about that in the future as well. So with that, I am going to wrap up and turn this back to Laura Lee.
Thank you all so very much. Thank you to the entire panel for this discussion. The stream of this portion of the session will be available on Opera America's website after the conference. So please send people to operaamerica.org and they can click on the YouTube stream and watch this discussion. You can refer friends back to it as far as what we were able to accomplish today. Saved in perpetuity. I would like to take one brief second to thank several people who have made this session possible. Our friends back in New York as part of the Opera America staff, Stephanie Helms, Craig Kaufman, and Audrey Saccone, who are part of our OA staff, and our whole Opera America staff and Opera Center staff that are there in New York manning the symposium there and the stream. We thank you for your contributing work. And the most important person I need to thank is my good colleague Lindsay Working, who has put together the entire New Works Forum work for this conference. As we say farewell to our streaming audience, I encourage you to tune into our next streamed live event from Vancouver, which is at 2 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. It is our keynote address from Don M. Randall, who was the former president of the Mellon Foundation and is a fantastic speaker. That would be 5 o'clock Eastern Daylight Time. And with that, we say goodbye to the wider world and our New York Symposium.